Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, occasionally, I will recommend certain content providers, YouTube channels, what have you, to go in and take a peek at. I tend to gravitate towards some of the much smaller. Obviously, most are very, very small, independent content creators. I enjoy the ones that are very raw and just in terms of life's experiences are interesting to watch. And one I've been recently taking a peek at. It is TCAV TV. It's capital T, capital C, capital A, capital V, space TV. TCAV TV, and it's short for Taylor Kavanaugh is the guy's name. And essentially, he is a former Navy SEAL, went through some difficult times, was removed from the Navy SEALs, and he eventually joined the French Foreign Legion. He is, to my understanding, the only prior Navy SEAL to currently be operating with the French Foreign Legion. And it's life stories, life experiences. It's the time currently in the French Foreign Legion. Very interesting story. So if you're into military, obviously in foreign affairs types of content, definitely go over there and check out TCAF TV. I enjoy it. Does good work. And really kind of multifaceted in terms of what he is talking about. So enjoy. Next, the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, things are really starting to deform in and around Avdiivka. The Russians have made additional progress both to the east of the city, to the south of the city, and to the northwest of the city as well. The Russians are continuing to pressure and encircle Avdiivka as we speak. Now, there has been some reports of additional Russian troop movements, Russian buildup in this locale that would lead one to believe that the Russians could be preparing for a major offensive operation to push directly into the city. Again, they're approaching the city from the north, from the south, from the east, and essentially cutting off the ability of Ukrainian defenders to be able to currently operate in and around inside of the city. But at this point, we're not certain the Russians are, in fact, going to make a major push. Meaning, are the Russians going to use large sums of armored vehicles and tanks and large sums of infantry to make some sort of final offensive towards Avdiivka? They could, but at this point, it does appear the Russians are content to just shell the Ukrainians into oblivion. It is basically one giant Ukrainian kill zone. The Ukrainians had the opportunity to pull out of Avdiivka and get those units that were in Avdiivka out of Avdiivka, and they haven't been able to do that. And the Russians continue to use these aerial glide bombs to great effect against Ukrainian forces, and it's taking a very large toll on the Ukrainians. And eventually, you have to face the facts, especially if you're a Ukrainian supporter, that Avdiivka is going to fall. It is just a matter of time and pressure, and Avdiivka is going to fall. And then furthermore, the Ukrainian operations on the eastern bank of the NEPA River. Again, this was an incredibly poorly designed operation with essentially no military objective other than to have the ability to make headlines, to create a false media narrative in the mainstream media. Again, this is the consolation prize because of the failure of the Zaporizhzhia offensive. The failure of the Zaporizhzhia offensive led to this operation on the eastern bank of the NEPA River. Now, this operation was supposed to occur for the Ukrainians if there had been a successful breakout in Zaporizhzhia, south of Orikhiv. Remember, the United States wanted all 9 of those newly formed Ukrainian brigades to press its offensive just south of Orikhiv towards Tokmak, this locale here. That was the original objective for the Ukrainians. And if that had succeeded, and realistically, the ultimate objective was a push towards the Sea of Azov. And if that would have occurred, then the Ukrainians would have landed amphibious forces on the eastern bank of the NEPA River. And that may have continued or had more success than what we're seeing now. But because of the failure of the Zaporizhzhia offensive and needing some sort of media positivity, the Ukrainians decided to go ahead and land these forces on the eastern bank of the NEPA River. This has led to a large number of Ukrainian naval infantry marine casualties in these ongoing operations. Again, the prospects of continued Ukrainian offensive operations further is simply not going to happen. They don't have the capability to do that. And so the Russians are content to have Ukrainian forces continue to operate in limited numbers on this eastern bank of the NEPA River, this very wet, very cold environment in which the Ukrainian forces are struggling, especially here near Krenki. So we'll continue to cover this and watch this, but again, essentially it's doing nothing for the Ukrainians except expending a very valuable, very well-trained Marine infantry. And again, across the whole line of contact, from Orikhiv, from south of Zaporizhzhia, all the way to Kupiansk, the Russians are continuing to just hammer Ukrainian forces. And it's becoming glaringly apparent that the Ukrainians are now becoming very short on munitions and ammunition. They are running out of artillery shells. They are having problems in terms of recruitment and the deployment of additional forces along the main front lines. And this is wearing down the Ukrainian military. Furthermore, there is political struggles going on in Kiev between the military apparatus, between the Ukrainian military, and the Ukrainian political leadership in Kiev. The Ukrainian military, as I've talked about this before, and I know some of you are going to tire of hearing of this, but it is just a simple fact. The Ukrainians do not have an air force. The Ukrainian military is very much aware of the fact that they don't have an air force, at least one that cannot contend with the Russian air force that is deployed in the zone of conflict. And thus the Ukrainians are just being decimated from the air day in and day out. Do you remember the first 1991 Gulf War? Some of you may, some of you may not. That's when I had originally joined the military. Gulf War I. Gulf War II, Gulf War I. But the United States spent many weeks prepping the battlefield and bombing the hell out of Iraqi forces in Kuwait and in Iraq. And I think at this point, this is what we're seeing from the Russians right now. We're seeing a very extended aerial campaign designed to degrade and destroy the Ukrainian army along the front lines and in the interior of Ukraine as well. Now, furthermore, the Russian military-industrial complex. There was a lot of talk, a lot of discussion going into this conflict, going in a week, 30 days, 40 days, 60 days, 90 days, that the Russians were going to have difficulty in sustaining its force construct in Ukraine. But now we know the Russian military-industrial complex has fully ramped up. We are seeing the Russians produce weapons, equipment, artillery, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, the likes we have not seen since Soviet times, or, I want to compare and contrast what happened with World War II. Obviously, the Germans were able to get early victories against the Russians. But that Russian-Soviet military machine started to expand, started to wake up, and then obviously in 1944, 1945, the situation had changed completely. Now, as the Russian military machine continues to ramp up, continues to expand, continues to grow, there has been talk of a Russian move against Odessa. Now, I wanted to address this. And I think at this point, a move by the Russians against Odessa is something that is not going to happen. Not in this war. I think right now the Russian focus is on territories east of the NEPA River. It's this area here. Odessa sits across the NEPA River. Not just across the NEPA River, across multiple large rivers. As you were to approach Odessa, this is what the Russians would run into. Now, once the Russians withdrew from Kherson, the likelihood that we would see a further Russian operation towards Odessa, and before that would even occur, the Russians would have to seize the city, Mykolaiv. The Russians attempted to seize Mykolaiv early in the conflict, but they failed. They weren't able to do it. Now, a move against Odessa would require, again, a large crossing by Russian forces across the Dnieper River, the seizure of Kherson, moving west towards Mykolaiv, additional river crossings at Mykolaiv, and eventually an approach towards Odessa, and possibly amphibious operations directly against Odessa as well. It's going to be very difficult for the Russians to do that. We would have to see a completely different force construct from the Russians in terms of force expansion, mobilization, and capability. And unfortunately for the Russians, we don't see that capability right now that could threaten Odessa. Now, is it possible that we could see the collapse of the Ukrainian state? We could see the collapse of the Ukrainian political apparatus. We could see possible mutinies in the Ukrainian military. Possible mutinies in support of Russian forces. Now, that would change the dynamic, and we would have to then reassess Russian capability to make a move on Odessa. But make no mistake of it, the Ukrainian military is growing tired. It is having difficulties recruiting. It is having difficulties maintaining forces in the field. It is having difficulties in supplying those forces in the field. Things are not looking good for the Ukrainians. And again, when you fight a major industrial power, like the Russians, and you have to face that fact that the Russians do have major industrial capacity to both build forces and to expand forces. And most importantly, as I've talked about, the Air Force issue. The Air Force issue is an element, is a piece to this conflict that the Ukrainians cannot navigate around under any circumstances unless they have the ability to meet the Russians in the air and then gain air superiority or air dominance on their own. And that's very unlikely at this point. Very, very unlikely. Without the direct use of NATO forces or U.S. forces against the Russians, which ultimately lead to World War III, that ability by the Ukrainians is not going to occur. So we will continue to watch what is happening on the ground. As always, thanks for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.